Hello, students. I have decided that we need to read the BFG still. So each day we are going to read just a little bit from it like we do in class. Now, we got to talk about what we read. So, I don't know, here's a picture from the other day. If you guys remember, the BFG and Sophie were able to get the Queen's attention, and they decided to have breakfast with the Queen. So this chapter is called The Royal Breakfast. There was a frantic scurry among the palace servants when orders were received from the Queen that a 20-foot giant must be seated with Her Majesty in the great ballroom within the next half hour. The butler, an imposing personage named Mr. Tibbs, was in supreme command of all the palace servants, and he did the best he could in the short time available. A man does not rise to become a queen's butler unless he is gifted with extraordinary ingenuity, adaptability, versatility, and dexterity, cunning, sophistication, sagacity, discretion, and a host of all other talents that neither you nor I possess. So he's saying that this man was her butler because he was talented and amazing. Okay, Mr. Tibbs had them all. He was in the butler's pantry sipping an early morning glass of light ale when the order reached him. In a split second, he made the following calculations in his head. If a normal 6-foot man requires a 3-foot high table to eat off of, then a 24-foot giant would require a 12-foot high table. And if a 6-foot man requires a chair with 2-foot high seat, then a 24-foot giant would require an 8-foot high seat. Everything Mr. Tibbs told himself must be multiplied by 4. 2 breakfast eggs must become 8. 4 rashers of bacon must become 16. 3 pieces of toast must become 12, and so on. These calculations about food were immediately passed on to the royal chef. Mr. Tibbs skimmed the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim over the ground, followed by a whole army of footmen. The footmen wore knee breeches, and every one of them displayed beautifully rounded calves and ankles. There is no way you can become a royal footman unless you look like you were interviewed. Push the grand piano into the center of the room, Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raised their voices above the softest whisper. 4 footmen moved the piano. Now fetch a large chest of drawers and put it on top of the piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a very fine Chippendale mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano. That will be his chair, Mr. Tibbs whispered. It is exactly 8 feet off the ground. Now we shall make a table upon which this gentleman may eat his breakfast in comfort. Fetch me 4 very tall grandfather clocks. There are plenty of them around the palace. Let each clock be 12 foot high. 16 footmen spread around the palace to find the clocks. They were not easy to carry and required 4 footmen to each one. Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle around the feet by 4 alongside the grand piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The footman did so. Now fetch me the young prince's ping-pong table, Mr. Tibbs whispered. There is a picture of them. So these are the footmen, and this is Mr. Tibbs the butler, and they're taking this grand clock. I know we've talked about these clocks before, that some of you say that your grandma and grandpa have that clock, or you have them in your house. That's awesome. The ping pong table was carried in. Unscrew its legs and take them away, Mr. Tibbs whispered. This was done. Now place the ping pong table on top of the 4 grandfather clocks, Mr. Tibbs whispered. To manage this, the footmen had to stand on step ladders. Mr. Tibbs stood back to survey the new furniture. None of it in its classic style, he whispered, but it will have to do. He gave orders that a tablecloth should be draped over the ping pong table, and in the end it looked quite elegant after all. At this point, Mr. Tibbs was seen to hesitate. The footmen all stared at him. Butlers never hesitated even when they were faced with the most impossible problems. It is their job to be able to do everything at all times. Knives, forks, and spoons, Mr. Tibbs was heard to mutter. Our cutlery will be like little pins in his hands. Mr. Tibbs didn't hesitate for long. Tell the head gardener, he whispered, that I require immediately a brand new, unused garden fork and also a spade. And for a knife we shall use a great sword hanging on the wall in the morning room. But clean the sword well first. It was last used to cut off the head of King Charles the First, and there may still be dried blood on the blade. When all this had been accomplished, Mr. Tibbs stood near the center of the ballroom, casting his expert butler's eye over the scene. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman? Fetch me, he whispered, the biggest jug you can find in the kitchen. A splendid 1-gallon porcelain water jug was brought in and placed on the giant's table beside the garden fork, and the garden spade, and the great sword. So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs then had a footman move a small, delicate table and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the Queen and Sophie. The fact that the giant's table and chair towered far above the smaller table simply could not be helped. All these arrangements were only just completed when the Queen, now fully dressed in a trim skirt and cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom, holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty blue dress that had once belonged to one of the princesses had been found for Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the Queen had picked a superb sapphire brooch from her dressing table and pinned it on the left side of Sophie's chest. So a brooch is like a nice little pin that she pinned on her chest. Sometimes it'll have diamonds or flowers. It's just a pretty little thing on your dress that you can pin on. The BFG followed behind them, but he had an awful job getting through the door. He had to squeeze himself through on his hands and knees, with 2 footmen pushing from behind and 2 pulling from the front. But he got through in the end. He had removed his black cloak and got rid of his trumpet, and was now wearing his ordinary simple clothes. As he walked in the ballroom, he stood up quite a lot to avoid hitting the ceiling. Because of this, he failed to notice the enormous crystal chandelier. Crash went his head right into the chandelier. A shower of glass fell upon the poor BFG. "Cunghumbers and bog squiggles," he cried. "What was that?" It's a picture. Oh, and I forgot to even see. See, there's Sophie and the Queen. Look, he's like so big. Well, it was Louis XV, the Queen said, looking slightly put out. He's never been in a house before, Sophie said. Mr. Tibbs scowled. He directed 4 footmen to clear up the mess. Then, with a disdainful little wave of his hand, he indicated to the giant that he should seat himself on top of the chest of drawers on top of the grand piano. "With a fizz-whiz, flush-bunking seat," cried the BFG. "I is going to be bug as a snug in a rug up here." "Does he always speak like that?" the Queen said. "Quite often," Sophie said. "He gets tangled up with his words." The BFG sat down on the chest of drawers piano and gazed in wonder around the great ballroom. "By gumdrops," he cried, "what a spiffling whoopsie room we is in. It is so gigantic I is needing binoculars and a telescope to see what is going on at the other end." Footmen arrived carrying silver trays with fried eggs, bacon, sausages, and fried potatoes. At this point, Mr. Tibbs suddenly realized that in order to serve the BFG at this 12-foot-high grandfather clock table, he would have to climb to the top of one of the tall step ladders. What's more, he must do is balance a huge warm plate on the palm of one hand and hold a gigantic silver coffee pot in another. A normal man would have flinched at the thought of it, but good butlers never flinch. Up he went, and up, while the Queen and Sophie watched him with great interest. It is possible they were both secretly hoping he would lose his balance and go crashing onto the floor, but good butlers never crash. At the top of the ladder, Mr. Tibbs, balancing like an acrobat, poured the BFG's coffee and placed the enormous plate before him. On the plate there were 8 eggs, 12 sausages, 16 rashers of bacon, and a heap of fried potatoes. "What is this, please, your majesty?" the BFG asked, peering down at the Queen. He had never eaten anything except for snozcumbers. So there's your picture. So now you can see how they made his chair. So there's the piano and then the chest. There's the table. So now he's coming up the ladder to give him his food. And then Sophie and the Queen over here. Okay, that is all we have time for today, students. I hope you enjoyed the BFG. We are getting so close, and then we will figure out a way to watch the movie. Thanks, guys.